So as we're clean slicing all of these, I want to just refer back to that entire series. So if you're finding this video or this podcast kind of on its own, and this is your first landing point, we're wrapping the series up. So what we talk about builds on itself over the course of many weeks and different episodes. I encourage you, if you're just listening to this one, to go back and fill in the gaps of all the things we're talking about. Because on the last episode, we talked about personality types and self-trust. And I think that self-confidence and self-trust are very related to each other. So we're going to talk about self-confidence on this episode, self-trust in the last episode. And again, like I said, we're slicing these as thin as one electron because I think there's really nuanced distinctions here.
Yeah.
It might even feel like it's too many distinctions.
Too much.
Too clean sliced. But I think there's value in it.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I think a lot of people would say self-trust and self-confidence are very similar things. And the series we started with self-awareness, which is effectively why we're doing all of this. Self-awareness requires us to be willing to reevaluate what we think we know about ourselves.
Yeah.
And so all of this, like you mentioned, clean slicing, very, very, very clean slicing. We even talked about the difference between self-worth and self-value. And we had a whole podcast on self-esteem, and we had one on self-certainty. And you mentioned the last podcast was on self-trust, and now we're wrapping up with self-confidence. These are all access points to inquiring within, going inside of ourselves and trying to figure out what we think. And the reason why we chose this group of selves is they tend to be the sticking point. They tend to be the reason why we don't want to do too deep a dive, because we get to that point where like, oh, I don't have high self-worth. I don't really want to look any further because that is a very disconcerting feeling. So why would I want to do any more dumpster diving?
Yeah.
Well, how are you defining self-worth? Maybe it's not that bad a Babadook, right? Maybe it's not that big scary thing. Maybe it's just you need to get a better relationship with it and understand how you experience this, and maybe it's okay, and maybe you can go further.
Yeah.
Same thing with value. And we talked about certainty, self-certainty, and what we're uncertain about, so that when we experience that feeling of uncertainty, we don't immediately put it down to something's terribly, terribly wrong. No, we all feel a sense of uncertainty about different things, and you just kind of have to hang there.
Yeah. And so from a principled place, how I look at this for somebody watching or listening, the best way to utilize what we've been talking about in this series and even in this episode is to apply it to the self. You know, a lot of people talk about personality types, especially in our Briggs system, in topical or type-based levels. So they go, the 16 types, how they'll do underwater basket weaving, and they walk through how each type will do some activity or think about something. And we talk about that often, but one of the things we like to focus on is the principles. And we spent, almost a decade now going through the cognitive functions and how you are wired as your personality type. And we're going to continue to address those issues, talking about each specific type, how they're wired. These selves are almost adjacent to that, though. And I almost imagine, if I'm listening along or watching, I'm almost imagining there's like a metaphor of almost an owner's manual I'm creating for my life, that I'm capturing not only how my personality type is wired, but these adjacent topics that really give me a glimpse into myself. So now I've got an understanding of, okay, I understand where my self-trust lies. I understand where my self-confidence lies. I understand where all these things happen. And I think we want to encourage you to reflect on your own personality, your own self. How do you show up with these elements? Yeah. How does this influence your experience in life? Because you have a really good starting point. Now we have a basis for you to take action and go create the life you want.
Yeah, I think there's value in understanding a concept through the lens of the 16 types. We tend to usually go through cognitive functions, which are the mental processes that support the concept of these types. But I think when it comes to something like this, we're definitely using type as an access point. And I think I've mentioned this in a couple of the podcasts in the series, that this is more like an on-ramp into self-inquiry. It's not meant to be a fleshing out of type theory more.
Yeah.
Nothing we've said is type canon. I mentioned a certainty model that I think works really well with understanding our relationship to our functions, but I'm the only one who said who is saying that. It's not like type canon anymore. And this has been my experience, that if I understand my relationship to each of these functions in this concept of certainty and uncertainty, it explains a lot. and I can understand myself a little bit more and maybe get an answer for why I behave so bafflingly in certain contexts of my life.
Yeah.
So when we dive into this final one, I think what we're trying to do is make a note that this is really less about you understanding type theory more and more about understanding yourself. And Joel, you even mentioned the last podcast about self-trust. Like, I forgot to tell people to go consult the car model. So if you're new to type, this is your dialogue.
Oh yeah. So if you're like, what the heck are you guys talking about? The cognitive functions, maybe you're either new to type or you have a relationship to the 4-letter code that you come with, like I have ENFP preferences. Well, that ENFP points to the cognitive functions I use to learn information and make decisions. And so if you just go over to personalityhacker.com/car model, that's a great reference to get started in understanding how that 4-letter code shows you your cognitive functions. That's what they're technically called. And they're unique to you. And it informs how you do everything, really.
Yeah. And I think the reason why we didn't mention it in the last podcast is because self-trust is it's such a human experience. We weaved functions and type a little bit into it, but we really talked about it more on a principle level. This week, we're going to talk about self-confidence.